A life that aligns, shaping the raw materials of life. What a well-lived life is aiming at. How a mind carries the weight of life. What principles help orient that life? Why these notes exist. Over time, certain questions return again and again in a person's life. Not necessarily dramatic questions, and not always philosophical ones. Often they appear quietly, in moments of reflection after a long day, or during conversations with people we care about. Questions such as, what kind of life am I trying to build? What does it mean to live well? What is actually enough? And how should I spend the limited time and attention I have been given? For many years, I found myself circling around these questions from different directions. Sometimes through reading, sometimes through writing short reflections, sometimes simply by observing the choices people make and the consequences those choices create. Along the way, I noticed something curious. Much of the advice offered about life focuses on outcomes, happiness, success, achievement, recognition, security. These are treated as obvious targets, as though a life could simply be aimed at them and eventually arrive. Yet experience suggests something different. People who pursue these outcomes directly often find them unstable. The moment one goal is reached, another appears. What once seemed sufficient begins to feel inadequate. The horizon keeps moving. This raises a quieter possibility. Perhaps the question of a life is not how to chase certain outcomes, but how to shape the structure of a life from which worthwhile outcomes naturally emerge. A garden does not produce fruit because someone demands fruit. It produces fruit because the conditions are right. Over time, a simple pattern began to emerge in my thinking. A life seemed to become more coherent when several elements aligned. A clear sense of what is enough. Values that guide behavior. Commitments that give life meaning. A mind capable of carrying the responsibilities and tensions that life inevitably brings. When these elements drift apart, life often becomes fragmented. When they move into alignment, something steadier appears. Sometimes a sense of sufficiency. Sometimes moments of gratitude. Sometimes a quiet form of joy. These notes are an attempt to describe that pattern. They are not offered as a formula for happiness or a set of rules for living. Life is far too complex for that. Instead, they are meant as a map, a way of thinking about the architecture of a life and the forces that shape it. Every life must work with the same basic materials: time, energy, love, work, and suffering. The question is not whether we will encounter these materials. The question is what we will make of them. Opening reflection: the life everyone is trying to build. At some point, most people notice something curious about the way life is pursued. Everyone seems to be chasing the same things: happiness, success, security, recognition. These are treated as the obvious goals of a life. Entire industries exist to help people pursue them. Books promise them. Advertisements quietly assume them. The message is simple. If you make the right choices, work hard enough, and follow the right advice, you will eventually arrive at a life that feels complete. And yet something strange often happens. People who achieve these things do not always feel at peace. People who accumulate them do not always feel fulfilled. And people who organize their lives around chasing them often discover that the target keeps moving. What once seemed enough begins to feel insufficient. A promotion leads to the next promotion. A purchase leads to the next purchase. Recognition leads to comparison with someone who has more. The horizon quietly recedes. Over time, a different question begins to appear. What if the problem is not that we have chosen the wrong goals? What if the problem is that we are trying to pursue outcomes directly, rather than building the kind of life from which those outcomes naturally grow? A garden does not produce fruit because someone demands fruit. It produces fruit because the conditions are right. Perhaps the same is true of a life. Perhaps happiness, fulfillment, and peace of mind are not things that can be chased successfully on their own. Perhaps they are the natural consequences of a life whose underlying structure is sound. If that is true, then the deeper question becomes simpler and more difficult at the same time. What does the architecture of a wise life look like? The pages that follow explore that question, not as a set of rules or instructions, but as a map, one that examines the raw materials every life receives, the tensions every life must hold, and the principles that help those materials come into alignment. Because while we cannot control everything that happens in a life, we can influence the structure within which that life unfolds. And sometimes, when the structure is right, something unexpected begins to appear. A quiet sense that the life we are living is one we can respect.